We're continuing through the book of Mark this morning, and Mark invites us to witness two scenes in the life of Jesus. So I'm going to read the first scene now, and we'll read the second scene later. The backdrop of this is that Jesus has been sitting in a boat along the Sea of Galilee, preaching to large crowds. He had to be put on a boat and set off from shore a little bit so the crowds would not overwhelm him. But he's been preaching all day and teaching the people. It says, on that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, that's to his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? And he woke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Of all of the variety of human emotions that God has given us, how many people would say that fear is their favorite? Yeah, I didn't think I'd get any hands this morning. Fear is not our favorite emotion. Being afraid of something is believing that it'll hurt me, it'll cause me harm, it'll disrupt my life in some way. But fear is a God-given emotion. It alerts us to potential dangers, and it keeps us safe. But a lack of fear can be pretty dangerous. Even though we may not like fear, it can be pretty dangerous. Just ask these tourists who visit Yellowstone Park every year and decide that the animals are petting zoo animals. Now, I've used videos without audio, and that's because every one I watched was stinking hilarious. But the commentary on the videos I can't play in church, right? So here's a young man from, sounds like Britain, who decided that a brown bear is something you can approach. Now, brown bears are not black bears. Black bears are fairly benign. Brown bears are just cranky. It gets better. Picks up the rock and offers a rock to the bear. Now, the bear looks small, but that's just the angle. They're now back in their car, probably wondering why that happened. Here's another one. This is a black bear. Now, if you know black bears, they are fairly benign and docile creatures. They're more scared of you than you are of them. However, when mama bear is with the cubs, that's somebody you don't mess with. This is a mama bear, and on the right there, you're going to see two cubs. Notice the natural, logical reaction from the tourists. The commentary on this video was really funny. Oh, let's run towards the bears. Oh, let me pick up my 5-year-old. Let me run towards the bears. Now, fortunately, this mom decided to get out early and the cubs followed. So apparently nothing important happened. Now, that's what happens when you have no fear. Not real good. But there's also a healthy fear that we can have. That's a healthy fear that respects something, that understands its power, is in awe of it. And now you see tourists who are either on guided tours or who are taking advantage of facilities where they can view the bears in safety. They don't have to be afraid and run away. They can respect those bears and enjoy them. Here's another picture. This is a Pennsylvania black bear. This was taken on my iPhone. One of the last hikes my dad and I took in the mountains before he passed. We were walking down this logging road. Now, we are long families of hunters. We understand the bears. We know how they operate. And this bear comes walking down the road towards us. So we just hopped down inside this tall grass and sat there and watched it because we know bears have terrible eyesight. There's no way he was going to see us. So we got to have this nice close-up encounter with the bear, and all you have to do is whistle a little bit, and they'll just go wandering off to the other place. But you respect the bear. If this was a bear with cubs, you would exit the area. Now, my point in all of this will become clear as we go through these stories this morning. We're in the book of Mark, and we've been called this series The Unexpected Kingdom. We've been walking through Mark, and we've been learning that Jesus and his kingdom really, they kind of challenge our perceptions of who he is and what his kingdom should be like. 2 weeks ago, Eric taught us that the kingdom of Jesus is controlled by God, not by us, as much as we would like to think the opposite. It's God who decides how it grows. It's God who decides who its members are. It's God decides how he wants to build his kingdom. And then last week, Dave taught us that we should need to trust the process, meaning that God has a process for how he builds his kingdom. And it doesn't seem quite effective to us. He calls people like fishermen and salesmen and people who don't seem to be capable of building a kingdom. But what comes very unexpectedly is that he wants his faithful people to be the seed planters, to spread the gospel to other people. But very unexpectedly, it's God's the one that causes that seed to sprout and grow. And even more frustratingly enough to us sometimes, he does it in his own good timing. And so we need to submit to that. Well, today, as I said, Mark invites us to look at two scenes in the life and ministry of Jesus. And in each scene, Jesus is present with people who are overwhelmed by circumstances that are outside of their control. Circumstances that come from without and from within. And because they are overwhelmed by these circumstances, fear is the dominant emotion that they express. But sometimes this fear drives people away from Jesus, and sometimes it draws people towards Jesus. And this is our big idea. Jesus unexpectedly uses things that overwhelm us to increase our faith. He unexpectedly uses the things that overwhelm us to increase our faith. And following the two stories, we're going to see that Jesus is at work in the things that overwhelm us from the outside and from the inside. So let's consider the outside, the story that we have just read. I wonder if you've ever gotten yourself into a situation where everything's good, calm, you're enjoying yourself, you got control of the situation, everything's fine, but then all of a sudden a few circumstances change, and you realize real quickly you're out of control. Well, this happened a few years ago. Our family used to go with Andrew's cousins up to Canada and have a lake house, and kids used to enjoy the lake, and our home was cabin was kind of in a back bay. So we bought the kids this inflatable boat, which was named the Bob for whatever reason, had a little electric motor on it, and they could tool around that back bay all day, and they had a blast. However, one day, they got out a little too far, and circumstances changed. If you want a picture of that, I can send it to you later. Don't worry. You get all the pictures you want. Got out a little too far, and circumstances changed, and they failed to consider two things. One is wind. Two is the limited capacity of a battery. Now, fortunately, one of them had a cell phone. So I got a text, come rescue us, as they were going further out and further out. Now, it was not scary necessarily, but it was actually 2 miles to the other side. So if they would have had a cell phone, they would have been gone a long time before we had to send out search and rescue. But we did bring them back in. But those circumstances changed quickly, and they became out of control. Well, the scene that we're coming to here in Mark is somewhat similar, although much more life-threatening. I have a map here, and I don't know how well you'll be able to read it. I want to set the stage so you understand what's going on. This is the Sea of Galilee, the blue blob there, in northern Israel. And it's not really a sea, it's a saltwater lake. It's a big lake, but it's not that deep. It runs, maybe 80 to 140 feet deep or so. And the lake sits down in a basin. You can see the mountains all the way around. It sits down in this basin. And the upper corner there, you'll see a little flag at the end of that red line. That's Capernaum. That's probably where Jesus was teaching at the time. And the red represents the potential path the boat might have taken to come to the other side. Now, the other thing we need to understand, the lower left-hand picture here is a picture of the Sea of Galilee. So you can kind of see how it's set down in that bowl. And sitting down in that bowl creates some unusual weather conditions. Storms, very violent storms, will come up in an instant. Because down in this bowl is warm, humid air coming off the lake, and from the surrounding mountains comes wind that is cold and dry. And when those two meet, they create violent storms. That picture in the upper right-hand corner is not the ocean. That's actually a storm on the Sea of Galilee. So have you ever seen a lake that can produce, waves that big? Those are huge. And so this is the scene that the disciples find themselves in as they go out onto the lake. One of these storms has whipped up. Now, they're not in a modern motorboat that has GPS and sonar and radar and all that kind of thing. No, they're in a wooden fishing boat. The picture in the upper left is the artist's reconstruction of what a fishing boat would have looked like in the first century. And we know that because the lower right-hand corner is a picture of a first century fishing boat that was found, I think, just in the last decade or so in the mud in the Sea of Galilee. They were only about 27 feet long. What's that, from me to you, Dave? Maybe? Something like that, a little shorter. They were only about 4 feet high, and they were only about 8 feet wide. So you're not talking a big boat. And wood, just bounces around all over the place like a bobber. So this is the scene. These disciples, many of whom were hardened fishermen who were used to being on the water, they're out in the middle of this sea. It's evening, maybe it's even dark by now. This huge storm comes up, and the waves are high enough that they're coming over the boat. The windstorm that the Bible describes is the same word for a hurricane or a tempest. So this has gotten wild pretty quickly. And the disciples have rowed and they rowed and they rowed and they've done everything they can. The disciples who were not fishermen are sitting there going like, yeah, dudes, you guys should know what to do, right? Because that's what guys do with each other. If there's weakness on one part, you're going to pounce right on that, right? So they're frustrated, they're scared, and where's Jesus? Sleeping in the back of the boat. If you can see that picture in the upper left, you'll see a little bit of decking in the back of the boat. There was kind of a bench under there, and Jesus was kind of tucked in under there, and he was sound asleep. So the disciples are scared for their lives. They are wet, they are cold, they are frustrated, and they come to Jesus and they say to Jesus in verse 38, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care about what's going on around us? Don't you care about the circumstances in which we find ourselves?" See, the disciples, this is kind of a harsh question. It's an accusatory question to Jesus. But what they were really afraid is, Jesus, you've abandoned us. Either you don't see what's happening or you don't care what's happening, but you've clearly abandoned us. Now, I'd ask us, we've probably been in that same place, and we might be even in that same place this morning, right? What's overwhelming us where, from our sight, from our perception, if Jesus is good at all, he's either ignoring us or he's abandoning us. That's what the disciples take to Jesus. Now, Jesus responds to the disciples' call. He responds first with action. And in his action, he demonstrates to his disciples and he reminds them that whatever your perception is, I'm more powerful and in control over any circumstance that can overwhelm you. He stands up and he says, "Peace, be still." That word peace is like the word for muzzling. He muzzles the storm. He effectively says, "Peace, be still, and stay that way." And he actually rebukes the storm. That word for rebuke is what he uses to rebuke the demons when he's casting demons out of people. Now, I'm not suggesting that this storm had any kind of demonic, forces behind it. There's nothing in the text to suggest that. But the picture can't be more clear that there are forces in our world outside of our control that would like nothing better than to keep us and Jesus from our mission. There are forces in this world, as David talked about in an earlier sermon, forces of evil that do want to overwhelm us. This is the reality that we live in as well. So he silences the storm, and then he responds verbally. Now I want to picture yourself in it. Try to picture yourself. This is vivid. You've just been fighting for a couple hours in this storm. It's probably dark. The waves have been crashing over. I mean, this boat is all over like a bobber. You're exhausted. You're dripping wet. The boat is half full of water. Jesus stands up, and everything becomes calm. And all you hear is drip, drip, drip. That's what you hear. And Jesus says this, "Why are you so afraid?" Well, duh, Jesus. That's kind of an irrational question, isn't it? I mean, that's irrational. Their fears were valid. They were afraid for very good reasons. So why can Jesus say, "Why are you afraid?" Then he goes on to say, "Don't you have any faith?" Well, of course not, Jesus. At this point in time, the disciples had barely the faith of a thread, barely what could fit in a little thimble. Jesus knew exactly what they were experiencing, and he knew exactly how big their faith was. And yet, despite their faith, and despite the fact that their question to him was theologically incorrect, he answered. He answered on their behalf. He says to them, "Why are you afraid?" Now, Jesus doesn't think their fear is irrational. If there's any scolding here, it's because Jesus says, I'm not scolding you for having the emotion of fear. That's valid in your life. But don't ever think that I don't hear you. Don't ever think that I don't see you. There's a great calm. And now the disciples have to decide what they're afraid of most. You can picture them standing there. Am I afraid more of what Jesus just did? Am I afraid more of what he just said to me? Or am I afraid more of who he is? And they picked the right one to be afraid of, because their fear of being afraid has now turned into awe. They say, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" You see, their fear is turned rightly into this reverence, this awe of how amazing Jesus is, how he acts on behalf of his people. You might have an objection. You might say, well, why is Jesus so harsh to them? He knew their faith. Why did he have to kind of needle them? Why did he have to dig it in a little bit? Well, does he think that I'm like that when I'm afraid? Because let me tell you, there are multiple times during the week when I'm coming to Jesus telling him I'm afraid for a variety of reasons. Does he think that of me? Well, let me give you two things to consider about this scene. First is that Jesus is with his disciples in the storm. Where was Jesus? With his disciples in the storm, experiencing everything that they were. He was not distant. He was not uncaring. He was not unfeeling. That's like the psalmist in Psalm 23. We know that psalm well. The Lord is my shepherd. It's a psalm that praises God for caring for us like his little lambs. But notice what the psalmist says. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear evil. Why? Because you bypassed the shadow of death. Why? Because you let me go around it or under it or over it. No, he says, when I go through that valley of the shadow of death, I have no fear because you are with me. And then he goes on, you prepare a table before me, meaning the visual there is you sit me down, you care for me, you give me the good things that I need that I can enjoy in the presence of my enemies. See, he's going to be with us, work in us, so that despite what's going on around us, our faith can grow in him. Second thing, Jesus responds to their cry. He always hears and he always responds. I've said it and I've heard other people say it. I keep praying, but Jesus hasn't answered. Let's call that what it is. It's a lie. It doesn't come from Jesus. It comes from our own sinful nature. Jesus always answers. The difficult part is sometimes he says, my child, you need to wait a while. But be assured, he always answers. Jesus knew their faith was tiny, and he knows our faith is tiny. But yet he will still act in the midst of these outside circumstances to work in our lives. Now, unexpectedly, that storm increased the disciples' faith because they moved from fear to awe, and they asked the right question, who then is this? And that question draws them closer in their relationship with him. Now, one final objection before we leave this scene is that you might think, well, this is all very well, might be helpful, but if Jesus is so powerful, if he's God, then why does he put us through this anyway? If he's good, why doesn't he just keep us from being overwhelmed in the first place? Then we can praise him for that. Well, the preaching team here at Grace would like to answer that question, and I'm going to give you their answer here in a minute, but I don't know who to quote on it. It's just from Grace preaching team, because it says, we don't grow in our faith if we stay in situations where we feel in control. If God keeps us in situations where we feel in control, our faith is in us, has no opportunity to grow to him. Now, the reason I say I don't know who this is, because if you have any insight into the way the preaching team works, we meet weekly together to talk about our sermons. They're reviewed 3 times before we preach them by the group, and they're reviewed 1 time after we preach them. And so we kind of have this whole mind meld thing going on. So the other week when I was listening to Eric used this in his sermon. And I wrote it down. I thought, wow, that's really good. And so when we were in our preaching team meeting, I said, Eric, I'm going to use that in my sermon next week. He started laughing, and he said, I thought I got it from you. So we don't know where we got it, but this popped out of the Grace preaching team. So maybe that's how we need to start quoting things in the future. All right. Jesus is at work on things that overwhelm us from the inside. Now, I'm going to read this scene to you, this next scene. Jesus is going to heal a man who's possessed by demons. Now, Mark, as we've learned, is a gospel of action. Mark has no time for the details. He is on a mission to get Jesus from birth to ministry and onto the cross. But in this particular scene, Mark is going to take 5 verses to go into a description of this man and his condition in vivid detail. And it's absolutely essential to Mark that we paint this picture in our mind and we get it etched in there. So as I'm reading, I want you to try to paint a picture of what's going on. Hear this language. It says, they made it to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart. He broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he is always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from the far, he ran and fell down before him, and the demons who were inside him cried out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Because Jesus had been saying to them, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged Jesus, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told those in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And there came to Jesus, and he saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed in his right mind. They were afraid. And those who had seen it described with them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged Jesus, and he said to him, and that he might be with him, and he did not permit him, but said to the man, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And the man went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Now again, here's the picture. They've come to the east side, and you won't be able to read it, but down here in this corner it says Gerasenes. And in this region here in the lower right-hand corner of the sea, this is a Gentile region. And it's called the Decapolis because there are 10 major cities in that region. So we need to understand on what shores has Jesus set foot. This is a Gentile region. So to the Jews, everything about it's unclean, ceremonially, spiritually unclean. The people are unclean. Their practices, their worship, their gods are unclean. The land is unclean. Tombs are unclean. Death is unclean. Everything about this man, the demons, everything is spiritually unclean. It's spiritually dead. And that's the picture Mark wants us to understand. I had a conversation with Rowan Howarth a couple weeks ago we were talking about AI-generated pictures. And got me thinking, because I wanted to have a picture for us to look at and say, what in our minds, can we have a picture of what this looks like? It is so important. So I fed these 5 descriptive verses into AI. This is what I got. I want that to soak in for a second. Here's a picture of this man. Now, after I got that, I put in, make it a little darker. And I can't show that picture. But let me tell you, it unnerved me so much I had to take it off of my screen. That's the picture we really need. Because the picture here is complete bondage. This man is completely overwhelmed by his own sinful nature and the forces of evil. He lives among death. And the only thing he can do is wait for his death. It is dark. It is violent. It is hopeless. And you know why Mark wants this etched into our minds? Because this man is me. This man is you. This is the spiritual death in which every human being lives apart from Jesus Christ. And Mark wants us to remember that for a very specific reason. You see, Jesus came to this earth to disrupt the forces of evil, the things within us, our own sinful nature that has overwhelmed us to the point where the Bible says that we are spiritually dead. Jesus said before his death on the cross, I know my own. I will lose none of them. And in this particular scene, Jesus was traveling towards this unclean land full of unclean people. He made a beachhead despite the storms, despite anything that the evil could throw against him. He made a beachhead in this unclean place because he had one that he was calling from death to life, and he would not lose them. Nothing will restrain Jesus from calling his people and acting on behalf of his people. Jesus passed through the raging storms which sought to overwhelm him, and he banished evil by the power of his word. He said, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. With his word, he saved his people. On the cross, Jesus said, it is finished. And in that moment, every single one of the sheep that God had given him, every single one, was guaranteed that he would lose none of them. Now, I want to pause for a moment because I've been talking about, bring that picture back again. Oh, we need to look at that picture again. I want to pause because Mark means this to be a picture of our spiritual condition without Jesus Christ. But I know there are some people here today saying, I'm a follower of Jesus, but that's my condition now. I'm completely and utterly overwhelmed with the circumstances inside me and around me. If you struggle with any kind of mental health, you'll know that. I go to bed 4 out of 5 evenings feeling like that. Because depression is a tough thing. But I want you to know that the Jesus who called you from death to life is the same Jesus who walks with you. And if he can call us from death to life, he can call us through whatever circumstances we're dealing with now. I don't have an answer for you about when he will. I'm still looking for that answer myself. For me, I've come to the conclusion that'll be on the other side of eternity. But the hope is that since he called me from death to life, he's going to call me from this life to the next life. This will be no more. Now, in the next few verses, it tells us we don't know how much time has gone by. It could have been a couple of days. We don't know. But this crowd forms, comes out of the cities, comes out to see what Jesus is doing, and they find this man who had been spiritually dead, brought to life. He's clean, he's in new clothes, and he's sitting at the feet of Jesus in utter awe. And he says to Jesus, I don't want to leave you. Now you might wonder, was the man just healed or was the man saved? It never says the man was saved. He never cried out in faith. Remember, Mark is a gospel of action. When Jesus called to this man, the man that we see now is clothed, in his right mind, desperate to be with Jesus, and sitting in awe at his presence. And Jesus, for the first time in the gospel, instead of telling someone to be silent, sends him out into an unclean world full of unclean people and says, sow my seeds. Preach my gospel. So the answer is absolutely yes, he was saved because this is what a disciple is. We've been talking about in Mark, Jesus is God because he does what only God can do. He's a true follower of Jesus Christ because he does what only a follower of Jesus Christ is called to do. And that's what we're called to do as well. Now, as we come to conclusion, there's one group of people we've forgotten about. That's the crowds. They come out, they see this picture, and it says they are afraid. But they're not afraid in all of Jesus. It's not this respectful awe. They're afraid because Jesus has just disrupted their economy. He threatens to disrupt their lives. He threatens to cause great inconvenience to their comfort. And that's enough for them to drive them away from Jesus and say, please be gone from our land. And what's worse is they drove away the salvation that he freely offers. Now, picking up your small child and running without fear towards a mama bear and cubs could end in death and dismemberment. Living in complete disregard for Jesus, or without a fear, or living with a fear that doesn't want Jesus to disrupt my life, that's the kind of fear that drives us away from him and from the salvation he freely offers, because this is the salvation that he wants for us. He says in John, so if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. Not only free from spiritual death, maybe free from some of the anxieties of this life now, but ultimately 100% free of all of it. Let's pray.